Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1266. Aleph Reis Samach Vov. So, where are we at? The plot so far is this. For the flow, let's just begin with the general flow of Ayin Beis.
Page, Simon, which page?
I just said it.
Sorry,
1266. Okay.
Thank you.
So the flow is as follows. Gan Eden, the discussion about Gan Eden, the two stages of Gan Eden as it's created, special quality of Gan Eden in the language of Malchus and Zoh, like a chosi, siblings. So it's Havaya Likim, as opposed to the rest of existence, which is only a Likim. Then through Avodah, through all the Avda L'Shamra, the service and Avodah of the human being in Gan Eden creates an abundance more than Gan Eden has on its own. That he called Yizbu, Atse Havaya Yizbu. It's sated and discussed at length what that sated level means. That it's not just the absence of hunger, but a completely new level of revelation that's even beyond the area of hunger or not hunger and thirst, as we learned earlier. I'm only mentioning that specifically because he mentioned it here where we're learning as well, that there's the two different levels. So there's a state where, like he brought from the Pasuk, that said, just going back to Nefesh Sava Tovus Nefesh, V'Nefesh Rava Kol Mar Masuk. Nefesh Rava is a hungry soul, and he discussed what that hunger is. And that hunger is, in Avodah, is the hunger and thirst for godliness. And that itself has two levels. It's a hunger, either you're hungry because you lack of food and therefore you're hungry, or because you've tasted it, you want more. Then there's the level of Nefesh Saveya. The Nefesh Sava is a Nefesh that's already sated. And that, he said, is a level that's even higher than, that's even more precious than gold and sweeter than honey, because you're talking about a level of Einig Atzmi that's Bilti Murgish, the highest level that you can experience, which is essentially, as he said, the Asid Lave, the level where you come to a place which is higher than eating and drinking. So just summing that up, and it's a level that's completely beyond. And that too is revealed, and that is Yizbu Atse Sada, Atse Havaya. The trees of Gan Eden are now sated. Then he asked the question, but okay, so you explain now how that we reached that place through Avodah. Great. But how can Gan Eden, which is the world of Bria, contain such a high level? How could souls contain it? How could basically it is defying the very boundaries of existence, because Atzilus is higher than Bria, and higher than Atzilus, Tainug Atzmi is far higher. And that's where he introduced Simcha Shal Mitzvah, the idea of Simcha, that Simcha broadens our parameters, basically. It actually shifts the very boundaries of existence, and the discussion of how Simcha reaches deeper into the core, and in turn Simcha also breaches and transcends the boundaries, and actually shifts the very nature of a human being and of existence. And therefore Simcha, that's why La'asid Lavi, when there'll be Simcha, the divine Simcha will be revealed, the entire world will experience godliness. The entire world will experience godliness, and it will be in a way that's natural to existence. Okay. I'm just giving the flow. So now, then he continued, and Gan Eden is a taste of that. It's not the full glory, it's not the full revelation, but it's me'ein, ke'ein elam haba, like he explained. And therefore, that's why you could have a Tainug Atzmi in Gan Eden. Then he explained the Simcha Shal Mitzvah, that you need both Simcha and Mitzvah. The explanation why you need both. Not one is not sufficient. The joy alone is not enough, because like he said, it's mostly halah. It needs to come into Hashuv, it needs to come downward. On the other hand, the Mitzvah without the Simcha doesn't have the revelation of these deeper levels. It has you access those deeper levels, but you haven't actually brought it into our experience. And that's what Simcha achieves, briefly put. And then he said, V'oidzos, which is now what we're in the middle of, he now introduced, to go back, and this really can be a little complicated, but as we'll see, it'll soon tie together the last 30 pages. Everything he discussed is going to come together, because now he's reintroducing something we learned 10 pages ago, and that is about Ahava. So he said the real Simcha Shal Mitzvah is after the introduction of Ahava B'Taanugim. That first comes the Ahava. So essentially we have 3 steps here. The Ahava, like he says in Tanya, that when a person can't fulfill mitzvahs properly, not properly, Mekaimon be'emes, in a true and sustainable way, unless it's Metech Ahava, that he's desiring to connect to God. Since the only way to connect to God is through Torah and mitzvahs, because you can't direct directly, because less machshava tfisa beklal. So it's the Ahava that brings to the fullness of doing a mitzvah with joy. How do we get to the Ahava? That's through his bonanus. Well, let me get to that in a moment. Okay. So that is essentially the Ahava that leads to mitzvahs and joy. Now, in that itself, it could be a joy that is tzaddikim, which he said is a higher level of joy, where there's completely unadulterated, undiluted. It's purely, like he says, mefulish, a tainug and simcha mefulish is the word that he used. Mefulish means open, completely open and expansive. And like it is in the Ummah, open, expansive, but in a negative way, in the sense of complete nonsense and frivolity and frivolousness, so too in Kedusha, they have the opposite extreme. Then you have a simcha that's shaykh to everybody, which he called a simcha that's connected, not because of purely for the divine, it's also in the Aveda, the person is also involved in this process. And actually, when he referred to Vaschanon, at the end of paragraph, middle paragraph on page 1265, you see Vaschanon Aleph. If you look up there, and it's worthwhile reading that, there he goes through in detail this levels that you could have tainug in godliness only because God is pleasure. God has tainug. You could also have you could have tainug because you also are having pleasure in what God has pleasure. It also could be because it serves your needs. He speaks literally, spells out a bunch of levels of how a person experiences tainug and elikus. It could be in other words, completely lishma. The language we usually use, no ulterior motive at all, is the highest level of simcha and tainug, which he's here bunching together in general terms. Then there can be something in the Aveda itself, there's tainug, meaning your work, you're feeling tainug, or you're experiencing tainug, or it's the tainug of God, but you're having pleasure. In other words, there's somewhat of a person is involved in that. And that's going to become part of this whole discussion, because if you recall, when he spoke about mutva, murgish, and muskel, what was the main theme? The main theme was, I'm giving this introduction to be able to understand the whole flow here, and then I'll sum up what we learned yesterday. The main theme was this: we begin completely subjective human beings. A newborn child, or ibur, the first state of idbur, or mutfa, is completely how we're wired. The natural instincts and reflexive behavior and the behavioral of a child. In Avodah, it's again what he said, purely action-based. You don't have feelings, you're just doing it. Behavioral. Now, what does that mean? That means it's really on your level because the person has not yet grown to experience something beyond themselves. So the most you can expect is say, listen, you don't necessarily, a person doesn't yet appreciate God on God's terms, so do what you're told to do. Fine. If you remember, that was like nihi, action-based. Then in that itself, you could also have some feeling, or at least you feel that it's worthy, like in chapter 16 in Tanya, that you don't actually feel an emotion, but your mind and your heart sense that this is a good thing to love. So there's a little more, but it's still called that behavioral. What is the process of maturation or growth in general terms? That you move away from the subjective self-interest with which we're born with, and we turn to be able to experience not just egocentric, but God-centric. In other words, to start experiencing God and something higher than ourselves. So as a person matures, that's where the mind helps you learn, but it still takes time, because even a 7-year-old child or a 10-year-old child can understand better than a baby, a newborn baby, but they're still considered a cotton. You can't expect from them self-control, and you can't expect yet to be mechuyev b'mitzvahs, be responsible yet for their behavior. They're being educated and trained. And as they grow and mature, basically they're moving from complete self-interest and I'll quote subjective impulsive behavior to objective reflective behavior, which is essentially the difference between heart and mind. As the Alter Rebbe says explicitly in Tanya chapter 9. What does he say the difference between the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Habamis? Nefesh Habamis resides in the heart, in the left side of the heart, where the emotions reside, which is why the emotions are essentially impulsive. The mind, on the other hand, is with the divine soul, because the mind is reflective. And if they're both working at their best, reflective mind will take control and mayach shalat alalev, self-control over the impulsive heart. The only difference here, he's not talking here about divine soul and animal soul. He's speaking in the divine soul itself, a less mature state and a more developed state. Clearly stated that he's talking about the divine soul. So as the divine soul matures, there's also a difference between the Nefesh Elikis as it is when we're born and Nefesh Elikis when we're adults. Because when we're born, again, it's just the natural. As we develop our minds, we begin to contemplate on godliness and so on. So the interesting twist here is, as we learned, if you recall, as we grow from self-interest, even divine self-interest, meaning, yes, I'm doing this because God is good to me. He's giving me life, he's giving me sustenance, as we explained. Then you move to a level of objectifying God, which means I start contemplating on God as he's not what he's serving my needs, but as God is beyond my needs. He's still part of existence, but he's not defined by being my sustainer, which is the lower level. And he called that a level where the cognitive, the mind is contemplating on godliness, like we learned yesterday, and I'll soon elaborate some more. And through that, and contemplating how the godliness within existence is only a reflection, because it's only that one piece of art is only a small detail, iota, compared to the whole so-called of godliness. The artist who's even beyond being an artist, but regardless, he's definitely the existence is only a reflection. So that in turn evokes a love. But now the love is not one that came from the natural child or the natural nefesh elikis, because it has a natural connection on a lower level. We're talking about a child's connection, like, basically emunah pshuta. Now you've developed a mind, an idea, a contemplation that evokes a whole new level experience of love. In chapter 44 in Tanya, he calls that avas elam, and he says it's necessary because that comes through avodah. That's exactly its milah, because it comes through the avodah of a person. The love that comes naturally is not through avodah. Maybe a little avodah to get it going, but the true contemplation, when a person is contemplating, like he said, on greatness of God, and that awakens a love that he wants to attach to it, that is a level of the mind, as the mind is giving birth to emotions, new emotions. But then everything turns around. Then he says, then you go to an even higher level where you connect now to the divine etzem ha'ava, the fundamental connection between the soul and the God. But he explained explicitly that this is no longer in a state of katnus, this is in a state of godless. In other words, a child's natural connection to godliness or the divine soul's natural connection without avodah is basically in a very immature, very basic level. When it comes, however, after the contemplation that gives birth to new emotions, then you reveal even a deeper connection, as he explained. If you want to go back on page, explain this very detailed on this is a while back, quite a while back actually, the difference between katnus and godless in this natural love. I think. Oh. It's around page 1233 or something like that. I'm just looking exact page. 1235. And that's where he said also that now when you come to godless Abba, you now also have the power to change the very nature of the person, if you recall. Bina doesn't have that power because Bina is generally connected to the aim revetzes ala frechim, as it takes care, hovers and protects the midas. So it still relates to midas. Whereas godless Abba is beyond it all. So godless Abba actually has the power to transform the very emotions. And then, as he explained, then as the emotions mature, they send away Bina, Shalach to Shalach Hasa'im. That Bina also goes back to the Yichud Pnimi of Chacham and Bina. And then everything, the Midas have been changed. The Moichin now led all the way to the Atzmus, which leads to Arich and Atik as they gaze at Arich and the 370 energies of Atik, which is essentially the Tainug Atzmi, the highest level that's rooted all the way before the Tzimtzum. Tainug Atzmi that is not even felt. And all that is, we're completely consumed with that love. That's Negei Benefesh. And that's the highest levels of experience. So the subjective emotions have now been turned to be completely absorbed with godliness. That's the context of what we learned at least the last 30 pages. So now when he goes back, we're coming back here, it's very clear that he's connecting it all back to that. So even though Simcha Shel Mitzvah initially came to explain how Gan Eden and Bria and how souls in lower levels expand their boundaries, their very nature is changed. That's what Simcha does. He's now connecting it back that too is prefaced by Ava, the Ava that we're talking about, the higher level of Ava. But so we're in the middle of right now is that there are two levels of Ava. That's what we learned yesterday. And that's what I'm going to discuss right now. But he hasn't finished the topic. I just wanted to reconnect it to everything we've been learning. And I hope this did some justice. There's a lot of material here that page 1243 is where he distinguishes between Ibra Rishon and Ibra Sheni, the natural love that's there, Lamata Metam Vadas, and the natural love that's Lamayla Metam Vadas. That's how he called it on page 1243. Okay, so you see here clearly the discussion of subjective human being slowly assimilating and connecting to a God that's beyond us. And more we move away from our subjective interest back to God. But then we reveal the very subjective connection we have to God, the fundamental connection that is revealed after that Aveda. So you have both qualities. You have the essential connection, but you also have the Aveda that now you own it. It's not just something you were given as a gift. But the truth is, at the end of it, we do have both elements, and that's going to be critical in this whole discussion that we're learning here. But remember, Aveda is a vital component, which is why Gan Eden grows through our Aveda, and the Aveda is really what brings it all into existence, or else it would just remain dormant. The fact that a neshama is a chelik elikam emal mamish, as I've mentioned a number of times, that's its natural personality. That's not Aveda. That's not the purpose of creation, is just to send the divine soul to this earth. It's that the divine soul with its faculties and its mind and its emotions and all its faculties should transform itself and reveal that divine nature and transform the world around it as well. So that's why Avodah is critical in this whole process. But again, a lot of this has been discussed earlier. I'm just trying to summarize it because I don't want to go back all those 30 pages, but the truth is, to really understand it, you really need to understand the whole connection all the way back to Mudva, Murgish, and Muskel. Okay, so where are we up to now? The next paragraph at the bottom of 1265, the Rebbe Rashab said that the Inyan is there's two levels of Ava, which we learned earlier. One is that comes from this Hisbonenus, as I just explained. Yesh Ava shechefet shemishtekik l'davka be'Hisbarach, and that's through Hisbonenus. He desires and yearns and longs to love God, but not because of his natural love within, is because he's contemplating and he appreciates the value. It's a Ava al Pitam Vadas. It's an Ava that comes from Seichel. The quality of that is that it's ours. You own it. In Tanya, again, Perik Memdal, he makes it very clear that you have to have that level, even though we have the natural love that every neshama has. Because that's what really brings the fire alive, he says. And that also makes it something that we are internalizing, understanding and appreciating God. Not just a child, for example, that has natural love to his father, but the child is also appreciating his father. He's contemplating in it. It's not just biological. So that is that level. And what is the Hisbonenus? He said briefly how he contemplates on the divine energy and vitality that manifests in existence, and how it's only a reflection, Baruch Sha'amar, one amira, one statement, all the worlds were created. and Baruch Shem Kved Malchusei, all this is a reflection. And this, through this, Chayfetz, so Mishtekik Ma'ed, this causes him to very much want a longing and yearning, desiring to attach and cleave to this higher reality, or the essence of the life force within existence. Yeah, and Kolsa Nafshi Lechatzus Hashem. His soul expires to the courtyards of God. That's what he wants to be involved. Instead of the courtyards of this world and the material world, he's desiring to be connected to that. However, you can't connect directly to God because less machshava tfisa beklal. So God gave us Torah mitzvahs, through Torah mitzvahs, and that's why he desires Torah mitzvahs. In other words, as he says in Tanya chapter 4, because he truly loves. Who performs the mitzvahs in the fullest sense, in a sustainable way, preserves, like he says, mekaimim be'emes, is someone that has that love. Because that love is the love to connect to God. How do you connect to God? Through Torah mitzvahs. So you're not just doing Torah mitzvahs by rote. They are essentially a result of your love of God. I mean, similar to what when it says in the Mechilta, when the Jews left Egypt and they asked God to give us now your Torah mitzvahs, what did Hashem say? First accept my kingship, my sovereignty, and then accept my gzeres, my decrees, my mitzvahs. What was God saying? God was saying, first love me. And then when you love me, you'll automatically do what I ask you to do. Like I spoke yesterday about like a relationship. You can just do things by rote, mechanically, by robotically, everything that your spouse says. But if it's coming from love, then it's mekaimim be'emes. And God wanted it to be a kiyum be'emes. He didn't want them just to say, okay, tell us what you want to do. We'll go through the grocery list and we'll do it. He wanted a relationship. And malchusei is a relationship. Gzeresai is a result of the relationship. Meaning once there's a relationship between the king and his people, then the people follow what the king asked them to do. If they don't have a relationship, they may do it technically, but it doesn't have that full vitality that's necessary. Okay. And then he explains that alone is going to bring higher levels of him, because remember, since this is coming from Tam V'das, once you taste it, he says, then you'll have another level of thirst and hunger, the hunger that comes from tasting something. But this is all the level of Tam V'das. He says, I'm again reviewing what we learned, is Midas Kol Adam. This every person can achieve, because it's a matter of you putting the effort of contemplating. If you're talking about a deep level of love that comes from a very Atzmus level, you could say you have a chelik alekam mamish, but it's not easy for every person to just access it. This, however, is a person can be expected to do. Yes, he needs to exert himself, and that's to come to this Ava. That's the mitzvah, as he says, "V'haftas Hashem l'kecha." It's a mitzvah. Every person love God. And that in turn brings like he said, Ava leads to Torah. Okay. And here I'm going to read inside again, even though we began, I'll read. I'm on the fourth line on page 1266. Aleph Reish Samach Vav. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So he says like this, however, now he's going to a higher level of Ava. Remember the beginning of the paragraph, yes, Beis B'chinas Ava. Here's a higher level of Ava. Excuse me? Can you all hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. That was Rabbi.
I couldn't hear it.
Everyone else hears me well?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, with me?
However, yes, Ava.
It was you, Tzvi.
Excuse me?
You guys just stop talking over the Rav. Let's go.
Okay. Maybe you should restart. Look at your internet, perhaps. However, yesh Ava shenasis me'eleha. This Ava we just discussed does not happen on its own. V'haftas Hashem l'kecha requires contemplation, requires effort. Like he said, but then there's an Ava that comes automatically. As I explained yesterday, it doesn't mean automatically, period. Al yedei hisbonus b'Hashem echad. But the hisbonus, as he's going to explain in a few lines from now, is not the giving birth to this Ahava. It's just awakening it, so to speak, stimulating it. So, but this comes me'elel through the hisbonus and Hashem echad. Now, before he said, "V'haftas Hashem Elokecha," and "V'hoya advarim me'ela." Interestingly, now he's going back to Shema, and the end of Shema is Hashem echad. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem echad. This Ahava is not an Ahava that's created from contemplation, like what we learned. Bina gives birth, or Chachma and Bina give birth, and Bina gives birth to the Efrechim, Revia Albonin, to the emotions. That's an Ahava Zah that is born from contemplation. But now he's talking about an Ahava Atzmus Sheba HaNefesh, a core love in the soul, Shemitzad Atzma, that is there on its own, not due to any other force. In other words, it's natural, embedded, and intrinsic to the soul. Sheyeshba be'etzem aval alakus, that the soul has fundamentally a love to godliness. U'kamoshin is barliel, yes, as we learned earlier, that there's the core love. So it's a very different type of love than the one we just learned. And now he explains. Uba gamkin, how does it emerge? It also arrives through contemplation. But here, look at the difference. He's going to say the contemplation is ba'atzmus ein sof or ba'achdus Hashem. The contemplation is the core of Ein Sof and the unity of God. Before he said the contemplation was not in the core of Ein Sof, how Elokus is manifest mislabish be'elamis, manifests in existence, and that all of that is just a reflection of the etzem. Here he's saying it's a contemplation in the etzem and in Achdus Hashem, meaning you're thinking about God alone, not God as he is in relation to existence, higher than existence, but still in relation. So he's not the piece of art, he's the artist of the art, or he's the artist that can do many pieces of art, but it still has some relationship. As we discussed a lot earlier, where he said that his bonanus, that what he called moichin, what did he call it? His bonus moichin chitzenis hamoichin, as opposed to primis hamoichin. He says you're talking there. I'm referring now. Let me look at it, the exact language, because it's exactly what he's saying right here, and that is the page with the Tanya, page 1229. He said this chitzenis hamoichin. That's how God manifests in existence. His bonus and tefus, you could grasp it, you could understand it. Then there's primis amechin, his bonus ba'atzmus ein sof. How God is completely beyond existence. Why is this relevant? Because if you're contemplating on God as he relates to existence, even though he's higher than it, infinitely higher, it still leaves room for existence. His bonus and atzmus ein sof is not about existence, it's about God himself. So the bonus now is, like he's going to explain, is Atzmus ein sof b'achdus Hashem. And he said in the parentheses, this Avedis said, Ayin Beis b'dibra masel b'chafei b'kislev, shezeh Avedis hanefesh alikis asmei. This is nefesh alikis itself. Now, we have to understand what that means exactly, because it seems that everything here is the nefesh alikis. But it could mean he means nefesh alikis as it's rooted in the etzem. But he says, avaloi ha'izbonanus, he's sibas ha'ava. The difference is, besides the contemplation is in a different level that I just explained, the contemplation is not the cause of the ava. Ki'im hi ava atzmis, because it's ava atzmis. Rather, it's a core ava, not being born by and created by the contemplation. So what's the hisbonenus for? Hisbonenus is because you need to become aware of it. Like I said yesterday, I'll say again now, you could have a love, an essential natural love of a child to a parent, but the child is not thinking about it. You can walk around and do all kinds of things and not think about it. It's there. The hisbonenus is just to remind you, oh, my father. And then that natural love reemerges. But what are you thinking about with your father then? Not about what he does for you, but you think about the very fact that you're connected with him. So that's where the Isbonus comes in. And but it's fundamentally a natural love that was there before the contemplation. The contemplation just brought it to the surface. Whereas the first love, the contemplation created that love. It didn't bring it to the surface. It created it that you now appreciate something that you would not have appreciated before. So it's comparable to other things that in life that we decide we contemplate on or we experience and then we learn to love. Not purely the natural, as he said, the natural intrinsic love. And he calls this, he says, this love is keshalheves ha'elam me'eleh. Like he used before, the word me'eleha, the Atzmus, that he has this, when he said, omnom, shenasis me'eleha. So the expression shalheves ha'elam me'eleh from Ba'aleischa, from Rashi, the Medrash, that the flame rising on its own. What means on its own? It means it has its own fundamental connection is there. Ubayeres kirish be'esh. And it's now burning like a flaming fire. So we have here the two things. The Isbonus gets it going, and that's why it's burning like a flaming fire. But what's burning is something on its own. It has it within itself. The soul has this natural love. Think of it like a pilot flame. The Isbonus in Atzmus Ein Sof and Agdus Hashem fans that pilot flame, and now it's burning in a very passionate, fiery way. Whereas the first love is not a pilot flame. The flame wasn't there. The Isbonus created the flame. The yearning and longing that the first level of love is something that came through contemplation of relating to God as God relates to existence, like he said. This on the other hand, is the essential connection between the Neshama and God, but it needs to be so-called stimulated and fanned, and that's what happened. So that's why it's called Shalevus Elam Eleha. That it's an Abba that comes from within the very pilot flame within the soul, and that's intrinsically embedded in the soul. And now he goes and explains how this love is also different than the first love, in the fact that the first love, there is a mavukash, there's a purpose. I have now contemplated on the greatness of God, that he's the core essence of my life, not core essence of the Ava connection, meaning he gives me life. So therefore, it's logical to want to connect with him. It's like connecting to your source. So there's a very clear thing. I want to connect to God. Here, because it's a fundamental connection that's there before, it's not about you. It's there before you have even a self, so to speak. So that's why he says now, "Ve'ein bo shum mavukash." It has no, it doesn't have a mavukash is a, what did I say? A purpose.
A motive?
What's the word I used before? Motive. I used the word motive. It has a motive. Mavukash has also
This
a
is merely
specific desire.
intrinsic. This is just an
a type
intrinsic.
of a goal, or motive. Shechefetz ba'agili. So it doesn't have that goal that I want to have gili. Ki'im rak me'etzem avoseh la'Hashem ba'atzmei. Rather, this is something that's just the natural love of God ba'atzmei, on its own. So let's you know what? Let me read it and then I'll explain what the example he's going to give now. Ukamoi, the parenthesis he adds, ukamoi ba'avos haben laha'av, like in the love of a son to a father. She bizgalus, when it's in a state of that it's revealed, because that's what we're discussing, that it's revealed. She'ein b'zeh shum mavukash la'atzmei. There's no desire, there's no gain that the child has, the son has in this love. Rak ma'avos ovav. All there is here is that natural connection of the love of his father. For example, if you were wanted to appeal to someone for a job, or you needed a charitable donation, or you needed something to a stranger. So you go to a stranger and say, "Listen, I need this and this from you, and I will pay for it, or I will you'll essentially, what's the word I want to use? You'll try to cultivate that person because you have a goal. The goal is to get something from that person. Even if you want that person to love you, meaning to respect you and to have a relationship with you, it's coming from you want that. That's what your mavukash is. That's your desire, that's your motive, that's your goal. When someone is fundamentally connected, a child to a father, it's not for a particular goal. Yes, he can come to his father and say, I love you, therefore I want money, or I want you to buy me a house, or I need other things. But that's regarding the things he needs. But the actual love, there's no desire there because it's not something that is premeditated or deliberate. It's the way he's wired that way. From birth, a child is naturally connected to his father. So therefore, when the love comes to the forefront and to the surface, it doesn't have any mavukash. It's just the expression of that love. I love you, period. With no agenda, with no goals, with no mavukash. It's just the love itself. So in other words, when you have a fundamental connection prior to you feeling it, that connection is deeper than anything you want to gain from it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't ask for things. That doesn't mean you don't want to ask. But the love is not dependent on what you gain and what you don't gain. It's unconditional, basically. Whereas the love of another person is absolutely conditional.
Perfect explanation of
naturally
Avinu
there.
Malkeinu.
As soon as it's conditional, it has the element of some mavukish, of some goal motive. Whereas here, rak ma'avis aviv, v'hu inyan, he continues. And this is the inyan what the Zohar says, and this is brought in many chapters. Chapter 10 in Tanya, chapter 44. Kibra de'ishtadl bosar avui v'imei yasir migarmei v'nafshei. Like a son who makes an effort for his father and mother more than taking care of himself and his own life. In other words, he'll sacrifice himself for his parents because of that natural love. You won't do that for a stranger unless you gain something from it. Here, because the fundamental love is there, it doesn't require any effort, and actually can even be to your detriment. But the essential connection is there, and therefore that natural love takes over, and that is therefore, in a sense, that has no mavukish. It's only it's on the relationship itself without a particular goal, objective, or motive, like he said right now. I'm going to stop in a moment for some questions. So stop. V'hi b'chinas Ahava B'Taanugim. And this is the level called Ahava B'Taanugim. A love with pleasure. So it's not just a love, because you could have a love for something and doesn't necessarily be Taanugim. Taanugim means that there's there is an essential connection here. That's how he's interpreting here Taanugim. And it says, B'Sefer Shalbein and Perik Mem Gimel, he's referring to Tanya chapter 43, and the Geras Sakei is the fourth section of Tanya, section 18. Now, why is he referring to these Tanyas? I have to look inside, but most likely is because Ahava B'Taanugim could also be interpreted different ways. And what he wants to refer to is this level that he's discussed in Tanya. So what does this mean? Why is it called Ahava B'Taanugim? He's going to explain now. The Hainu, and this means Shemisaneg al Hashem, that he has pleasure in God. Oineg nifla, awesome, an amazing, an awesome pleasure. B'simcha rabba v'atzuma, with a great and intense joy. He's using the word simcha, not just ava, simcha. Simcha sanefesh, the soul, the joy of the soul. V'chaloisa b'tamo kitev Hashem v'noim ne'imes arevis ad lahafli. Oh, and it expires b'taimo, in tasting, because God is good, v'noim, and delicious or precious, and ne'imus arevus, and a sweet, delicious taste. Ad lahafli. To lahafli means without limit or without one. Lahafli means wonder, but ad lahafli means in a wondrous way. So these are a lot of expressions here, which are some of it a combination of some verses and some expressions and explanation, but basically he's describing what means Ahava B'Taanugim. So I'll read it a second time. Shemisaneg al Hashem, he has pleasure in God. Einig nifla, a wondrous or amazing or awesome pleasure. B'simcha rabba v'atzuma, in a great and intense joy. Simchas hanefesh v'chaloisa, and the joy of the nefesh and its complete expression. When you're joyous, you completely expire, get absorbed, so to speak. B'taima kitev Hashem, in the taste of God, because God is good. V'noyim Imma sarevus ad lahafli, and it's sweet with, and noyim is, I say noyim, well, precious, delightful in a sweet delight. Ad lahafli, to amazing levels, or to wondrous or spectacular levels. And now he concludes what he said earlier. Valzen nemar. And on this we say, the second level, remember, simchu tzadikim b'Hashem. This is tzadikim dafka. That simcha, that tzadikim rejoice in godliness. Shehi ha-simcha v'ha'enek b'china b'Hashem. This is the joy and the pleasure in God, mitzad mahusei v'atzmusei. Just because God is the essence and the essential core essence of God, b'li shum mevukesh, without any ulterior motive, without any motive, goal, interest, destination, objective. It doesn't have any hunger or thirst at all. If you remember when we learned earlier, there's a level where you're hungry for God and you get filled, and then you're hungry for more. Then there's a level, elam haba that does not have, not like the Suda of Levyasan and Sher Habar. There's a meal. So there's food, it's sating you, filling you. Then there's a level that doesn't have Avim Samoyin Klal. I'll just read back for a few pages back. When he said that, bottom of page 1259, so he said like this, the two aliyas l'asalavi, the bottom of the page, it's an einig atzmi, you don't even sense it, because you're completely absorbed in it, and there's no you, there's no identity of self. And I just wanted to read one more line there where he said, higher than Berurim. Yeah. Yeah, that was basically what he said. So it's the same teichen. So you can't even call it hunger and thirst, because hunger and thirst implies that you're here and you're hungry for something else, and then you fill yourself and you quench your thirst and you fill your hunger. You sate your hunger. Here he's saying it's higher than all of that, because this is the simcha of the tzaddikim, u'kamoshen is barely ill. Okay. So there we have now two levels of Ava, which correspond to two levels of Simcha. One is a Ava that comes through contemplation, and there is a motive, and there's an intention. And that's shaykh to everybody. And that's when we say, Tachas Shalei Avadata B'Simcha, everybody. Everybody can reach that level of joy. In the delight, the joy that comes, the Simcha Shal Mitzvah, that comes result of loving God and wanting to connect to God. So you do it through Torah mitzvahs in a joyous fashion. A higher level of joy is coming from an Ava that is coming from the fundamental connection between neshama and God. So even though every neshama has it, but not every neshama accesses it. The tzaddikim access that level. It's called Ahava B'Taanugim, and in a revealed way. And there, the pleasure and the joy is not because you're gaining something, because it's quenching your thirst or you're taking pleasure in God. It's just God himself. It's your natural connection to God. And therefore, that itself is an end in itself. It's not a means to an end. It's not because you're gaining something or you're even experiencing it. It's completely elikus, like he says, just to read it again, the words. Simcha v'einu b'Hashem b'tzad mahusei v'atzmosei, she'en b'zem b'li mevukesh. Yeah. Like he said earlier, the Ava that does not have the mufulish, that does not have any murkav, she'ena murkav b'shum davar. I do want to add, and thank you for Yitzchak for posting it, the source of this section with Plishtim, and what we're learning now, not necessarily this paragraph, but the previous one, is in Teres Chaim Teldus, where he talks about Plishtim, and he discusses this idea. There he repeats several times the Tainug She'ena Murkav. So looking there helps explain some of this, because here it's mentioned, but not elaborated upon, except what we're learning right now. So essentially, we're talking about a Tainug that's Murkav. That's a Tainug that has some sensation, Murkav, with the fact that I'm also feeling the pleasure. And then there's a pleasure, like I've explained many times, like a fish in water or water in water. Water doesn't feel water. Water is water. It's a state of being as opposed to a verb. So in more Balabatish terms, you can say the Ava or the Simcha that is Murgish, that is based on some Avukish, is like you're here, you're in a state that's not joyous, and now you've arrived at a state of joy. That's a verb. That's an experience. I'm joyous. And then you become joy. You become one with the experience, like we learned earlier, that it becomes your natural self. So you don't have two things. There's no object and no subject. So it's a noun instead of a verb. It's not just you love it, something that is above you. Now I love it, or I'm joyous in it, or I'm taking pleasure in it. Once you become one with it, like a child and a father who are one, and you feel it, you're feeling the very core essential experience. It's not about me loving you, not me taking pleasure in you or me taking joy in you. The me is no longer there. The me is as one with its source. And that was what he means, as opposed to the lower level of Ava. So one you could say is like a verb, the lower level, experiencing it. The other one is beyond experience. You're so much in the zone, you're not even sensing it. You become absorbed in the very experience, and that's all that really matters. Now I said, we've learned these two levels. This is the difference between Yichud Pnimi, Yichud Chitzeni of Abba Imma, and Yichud Pnimi. So let me read till the end of the paragraph, then I'm going to stop just to finish this subject. So he says, Beis B'chinas Hanal. And these two levels of Ava and Simcha that we just learned, the outer courtyard and the inner courtyard, which is discussed by Likutei Torah, Dibra Masked Kisishma B'Kel. So Likutei Torah in the Maimer Kisishma B'Kel talks about two courtyards. Now remember earlier we learned that the king, when he's within his own palace, in his own inner sanctum, he's not even, the gate is closed. No one's allowed in. We learned this earlier on page 1263. We was talking about Simcha. And then when the king is in a state of Simcha, what happens? He comes out. The gate opens, he comes out to the nation. And that's what he called Tara from the Zoyar. Yosef Malka Besara. The Tara, the king sits in the gate. But if you remember, he used the word gate. He also used the word chutzah there. He comes out into the chutzah because like you have Shabbos and Yom Tov, the chutzah is open. Shar ha-chutzah, shar ha-chutzah ha-primis ha-peina kodim. The gate of the inner courtyard is open, whereas all week long it's closed. So I just wanted to refer back to that. That's what he was talking about in general, but there he didn't talk about two levels. Now he's going to say there are two levels in the chutzah. There's the inner courtyard, there's the outer courtyard. The chutzah ha-chitzena, the outer courtyard is referring to hu ba'er shebeseder ishtalshlos. That's in the level of the oyer, the divine energy that relates, that's within the cosmic order. And that's the outer union of Chachma and Bina, as they relate to Zah. But the inner gate, the inner courtyard, Atzmus Ein Sof. It's in the core of Ein Sof, that's higher than the cosmic order and structure. And when you mamshech from there, just like it is higher than the shtalshlus, also the amshacha is also one that defies or transcends, you can say, the normal hierarchy and the normal parameters and order of shtalshlus or canal, as we discussed earlier. And this is the inner unity of Chachma and Bina. the zivuk shlim that he said, complete union, higher than ishtalshus, v'hainu commission is borleil. This means, as was discussed earlier, the aveda and etzem haneshama, the higher level, mamshichim b'chinas yichud pnimi da'ava. To the etzem haneshama, like mesiris nefesh, v'chol moedecha. Everything we learn on that level, that is mamshich, the yichud, the inner union of chachma and bina. So let me stop here and let's take any questions. Now, it's not completely finished yet because there's still the discussion. So is it simcha that does it or is it b'chol moedecha that does it? Because earlier we learned b'chol moedecha, mesiris nefesh, mesiris haratzon, where a person connects to the etzem and neshama, like he's saying here, is the element that reaches that deepest level. Now we've also introduced simcha because simcha reveals it and not just reaches it, but reveals it and breaks through all these boundaries and so on. So he's still going to continue to explain the next paragraph. So there's one more paragraph to really finish this up, but it's that the theme is starting to emerge. Now we're going to go over it more than once. You know, I know what I said earlier was quite dense. I brought together a lot of pages together, but I hope it made some sense. But let me stop here if anybody wants to clarify or ask anything.
I love it. I love it because you first said the first lower level is Malchus, and the high level is Imma, Abba Imma. So it's like almost like Alvino Malkenu. Alvino, try to do Alvino first, and then if you can't do it, you do the sunniest. You go Malkenu. It's so beautiful. It makes so much sense to me now. I'm like flying from this.
Great, that's great to hear. Do you need a bagel and butter delivered? Okay, good, very good. So I'm glad you're getting it. Good.
Actually, it's sort of like turned upside down, topsy-turvy, my understanding about a significant thing, which is Ahava B'Taanugim. It seems here that the Rabbi is clearly saying that there's two types of love. There's an intrinsic love, and then there's a loving relationship that's developed through avoda.
Yeah. And
the intrinsic love is if you can reveal that, is a love that is Ahava B'Taanugim, whereas the one that results from avoda is certain. I don't know if he's discussed it a link there, but maybe is not that level. And I always thought so. Therefore, in your mashal, in your example that you said about a young child is mutva, murgash, and muskal. That is a path, a natural path of maturation. So a young child has that essential connection. I want my mommy, I want my daddy, and I want my tati. And that is not from, he doesn't want maybe anything else. He just wants it. You know, a baby cries, where's my mommy? It's like it's like an intrinsic relation that the child feels without asking for anything, or not as a result of avoda. And it seems like that level is what is the Rebbe is describing here as Ahava B'Taanugim, with us in Hashem, us being the baby child and Hashem being, we want our tati.
No,
Tati B'Shemayim. Not right? That's what. Well, then, okay, that's why I'm confused about it. Okay, fine.
Well, that's why I referred you to page 1243, where he speaks about the natural love on a child level, and then there's the natural love on a very high level. In other words, the child begins, it's like saying that every child has a munah pshuta. Without any effort, a child has natural love and natural faith in God. But that's not the kavanah. The kavanah is avodah. Now the child goes through avodah and goes through then the acquired love, and then comes back to the intrinsic love, but now it's much more sophisticated because it followed the acquired love. That's what he explains on page 1243. So therefore, Ahava B'Taanugim is the highest level. Basically, a child's Ahava is just mutva. You don't even call it Ahava B'Taanugim, you just call it its natural love, like you said, for its parent. And by the way, it's completely subjective. You could argue that that love is simply because the child is hungry and thirsty, and that's all it needs. But even if you say it has, like we know, children have an essential connection, like a ish pashat to God, no problem. But it's definitely not developed. What you need is to develop it through avodah, get acquired love, and then you can come back to get to a essential intrinsic love. But now it's on a much more sophisticated and higher level of complete bittul that is not shaykh to a child. A child cannot experience Atzmus muhus the way he's describing here, but Taanugim, because Taanugim means you're completely in that level. You've reached that level. So yes, it's essentially, we all have it by birth, but only tzaddikim reach that level. So you have to go back to page 1243 to see these two different, where he speaks Ibur Rishon and Ibur Sheni, and he literally compares the natural love of a child to the natural love of God that people on the highest level have. So in other words, if the Rebbe is Ahava B'Taanugim, it's very different than the natural love of a newborn, you can imagine. And in Tanya chapter 44, it's to really understand this, it's important to learn, because there he explains the Maila of both the natural and that which comes through Avodah. And each one needs the other. And it's actually, ironically, it's the Avodah that leads you to Ahava B'Taanugim that you could not reach without the Avodah. But Ahava B'Taanugim at the end is ultimately intrinsic, but you can't access it if you don't have first the Avodah. I'm talking about in addition to these bonus he's talking about here. So it's like to put it in simple terms, to say I don't know and God is greater than I am, every newborn can say that. But the I don't know and God is greater than me of an 80-year-old who's learned Chassidus all his life is very different than the I don't know and Amunah Pshut of a child. Because the person who went through the whole process and then comes like Moshe Rabbeinu and then says I can't see God is very different than a little child saying I can't see God. So yes, they have something in common that God is beyond everyone, but one has now become completely absorbed in it. That's why Simcha B'Tzadikim B'Hashem, only Tzadikim can reach that level of Simcha. Because you're talking about a level that's completely on an Atzmus level.
So are you saying that the pilot light that's flamed up and turns into a flame that's going up in passion and by itself eventually will come to a level that he wants to go back to being a pilot light, realizes that that's the highest level?
No, the pilot light has now consumed him completely. It's no longer pilot. He's no longer there. He's now been, his whole being is the pilot flame. That's
but it's Murkav with Avoda. Isn't it Murkav with the relationship of a Mavukash, the level of Mavukash Hashem that I want a relationship?
At this point, there's no Mavukash because you're just completely absorbed. There's no motive on it. It's just the natural love that you and God, it's just a connection to God Himself as God is. There's no you. That can only come on the highest levels. He says clearly it's tzaddikim, not everybody.
Okay.
Fine. So we'll conclude here at the end of the paragraph on page 1266. Any other questions?